Thank you very much indeed. Actually, I'm going to tell two jokes. Well, actually, three. So let me begin by saying my name is Simon Conway Morris, and I am a professor of evolutionary paleobiology in the University of Cambridge, and I don't think they know I'm here. And that reminds me of another famous story from the First World War in the Mediterranean with the Royal Navy. And at that time, of course, there were a variety of sizes of ships. Some were very large battleships, some were much smaller, even smaller than a corvette. And on one time, one of these very small boats, almost the size of a trawler, saw a British battleship just in front of it, and it signalled rather cheekily to ask who they were. And after a short reply, not an email, by a semaphore signal, the reply came back, "Does your mother know that you're out?" And I have to say, I feel somewhat in the same set of circumstances. So like a few of the other speakers, I'm going to go fast and probably loose through a whole set of biological concepts. But as is now my custom, my intention is to unhinge all of you right at the end. And I think this time I really am going to succeed. And the measure of that will be that I will never, ever be invited to a conference like this again. And in that sense, I should also say I'm very grateful to the John Templeton Foundation, both for previous funding and for a new grant we're about to start next year to do with some of the major questions in evolution. Well, to begin with, this gentleman here, of course, needs absolutely no introduction. The old boy's more than 200, and indeed his success, both as a thinker and the influence he's had on the world, needs no emphasis at all. But of course, there are many ramifications in the way in which Darwin understood the world, which continue to interest not only evolutionary biologists, but potentially also philosophers, metaphysicians, and theologians. And amongst them, of course, is the general idea, which is by no means restricted to Stephen Jay Gould, although here depicted with his famous book, one of many famous books, Wonderful Life, to the effect that the neo-Darwinian synthesis insists, amongst other things, that to the first approximation, evolution is a random process. And when you think about mutations, mass extinctions, and alas, if I had time, I would also rattle you in that area as well. The notion would be is that evolution, unlike some other sciences, is effectively a historical process and thereby is unpredictable. So we'd have no real sense of where we might go, where we're given the starting block, as Stephen Jay Gould suggested in his book, Wonderful Life, looking at the work which I and others have done on the Burgess Shale, as to were we famously to rerun the tape of life. Was there any sense in which a human would be a predictable outcome? And that's something which I think is almost universally held by neo-Darwinians, that such an outcome is beyond any hope of predictability. Well, these sorts of counterfactuals, rerunning the tape of life, of course, are things which appeal to intellectual historians as well. And when I show you the next slide, I'm aware that I'm in a country where there are some very uneasy memories. And thank God these memories didn't extend to my country. Nevertheless, it's fascinating to imagine what might have happened if the Luftwaffe under Hermann Göring had actually managed to destroy the RAF in 1940. So that here we see Hitler's victory parade with Führer with one or two of his chums, I think that's Martin Bormann, in April 14th, 1941. Well, fortunately that did not happen. But in this and many other books which explore all sorts of counterfactuals, I think as an intellectual exercise, this is in fact very important indeed. And military historians are particularly fascinated in this area for good reason. War games is what they call them. But on the other hand, in this book, edited by Robert Cowley, and some of you may well have read this essay, the essay which attracted my greatest attention was this one here. Now, happily, we have an audience here where I don't have to use a pointer and say, this is Pontius Pilate, this is Jesus Christ, etc., etc. But the essay asks us to imagine what would have happened if Pontius Pilate had said to Jesus, "You're free," and then in his ear, "and the very best of luck." Well, the little we know about Sejanus's chum, Pontius Pilate, suggests that that was most unlikely to happen. But nevertheless, it's historically conceivable. I think our history would be utterly and radically different. And in this sort of way, one can inquire, as so cleverly this essay does, is in fact, and I recommend it to you very warmly, because the denouement at the end is totally brilliant, and it'd be a shame, and alas, I don't have time. Do I have 3 minutes left? Thank you. The history still pans out in the end, albeit by a different route. Now, as I think it was Jennifer Wiseman was pointing out yesterday, a great deal of this matters scientifically, because, of course, we have this slew of exoplanets coming on board, And I have to say, and I'll make this point in another context in a moment with regards to science, scientists themselves should be rightly staggered at their own success. Who would have dreamt, even 5 years ago, that Earth-like planets are likely to be found in enormous abundance, and perhaps even more rapidly than we could have hoped, some of their atmospheres might be investigated, and then we can begin to target what might possibly be a suitable abode for life, even intelligent life. So there's a great deal to play for, and it matters very much. Now, what I want to do is really two things very quickly. The first is to draw attention to aspects of evolution which are well known but sometimes not fully considered. And the first is to do with the fact that although we associate biology as typically squishy and the sorts of things which left on a laboratory bench after a few days once dead begin to smell, nevertheless have a sort of geometry to them which was articulated, again brilliantly, by Darcy Thompson in his book Growth and Form, and has always been the ghost at the banquet. There's clearly organisational principles in biology, and when one sees something like the cross-section of the nautilus shell here, a marine organism which uses those chambers, here cut in half of course, to support itself in terms of buoyancy, we have a famous log spiral. And this, I'm told by people who understand mathematics, accords to the well-known Fibonacci series. And here I draw your attention. I do want the gentleman here to pay very close attention to mathematical curves, and in no way at all to be distracted by anything else which might be presenting itself. So these sorts of geometric forms argue, as a number of people have pointed out, to some sort of self-organisation. And it's not to say that they're not mediated by genetic processes, indeed they are, but it does suggest, in the same way as perhaps the alpha helix in many proteins spontaneously forms, that there are various arrangements which will, in a sense, come out metaphorically of nothing. So too, another aspect which has intrigued me very much for many years is the well-known phenomenon of evolutionary convergence. And here I only have time to talk about a couple of examples. This is perhaps my favourite one, which I've probably overused these days. Here we have two saber-toothed cats. But as I think most people in this room will now well appreciate, the cat up here is not a cat, it's a marsupial. It's extinct from South America. And this is a genuine article down here. And those of you who are not familiar with phylogenetics, what this means is that this animal here is far more closely related to a wombat. This animal is far more closely related to a giraffe than they are to each other. And I think you agree, it's an example of convergence on a particular form. It almost has the sense of an attractor. It's a powerful example of how maybe some of the options in biology are relatively restricted. And of course, this is an area which extends into, I think, the whole of biology, but in as much as I want to talk about the evolution of intelligence in a very amateurish way, what I think is worth thinking about briefly to begin with is the nature of sensory systems. And here too we have a classic example of an evolutionary convergence, this time between a close relative of the earthworm, that's a cuttlefish here, and here's a close relative of a starfish, that's you if it's any consolation. And of course independently, and I'm not going to talk about PAC6, independently they've arrived at the camera eye. And this is a form of optics which has evolved independently something like 7 times, even in the jellyfish, as it so happens. Now, I could spend hours talking about the evolution of sensory systems, and I think they're very interesting, but in one way they matter for 2 reasons. First of all, because presumably in some way they underpin the acquisition of exterior knowledge, so in the way that I think Descartes was interested in. But there's another aspect about sensory systems, and indeed much of biology, which I think is strangely underplayed at the moment. And that is, to give this particular example, if we look at sensory systems, noses can detect single molecules. The electrical detection systems in sharks work at the level of nanovolts. Specifically to this slide, what we know is that our ears, here we have of course a sonic bang, work to the levels of thermal noise. And correspondingly, in principle, an eye can detect a single photon. In other words, sensory systems have literally reached the limits of the physical universe so far as biology is concerned. So far as biology is concerned, you can't see beyond a photon. You can't hear beyond the rumble of Brownian motion in your ears and that sort of business. So that, again, as I was mentioning with respect to exoplanets, and this may seem facile, but I'm not sure it entirely is why science matters so very much, because we have this instrumentation, which has been brilliantly shown. Chris Impey was showing this as well, how one is able to see far beyond, if you like, the natural spectrum of biological possibilities. Now, That, of course, is a product of technology and a product of human imagination, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. What I now very briefly want to review is to go back to the cognitive examples of convergence, and again, just refer to these extremely quickly. In brief, what we see is that in a number of advanced animals, amongst which actually in certain cases I'd include the octopus, we have some fascinating convergences of cognitive architecture. Very quickly, we see, for example, in the bird, the birds are songbirds, that the way in which they learn to sing, and indeed certain properties of their song, are remarkably analogous to our language. It's not language, but they're remarkably similar, even to the level of neurobiology. Correspondingly, if you want to find a successful toolmaker, please do not go to the chimpanzee. Go to New Caledonia and see the operation of the probes and other structures constructed by the New Caledonian crow, which have a capacity, making these probes, as shown here, to extract beetle grubs, which again seems to be not only independently derived, but also represents, according to Hunt and Gray, a proto-technology. Why does all this matter? Well, as my colleague Nicky Clayton and others in Cambridge have shown, to the first approximation, the cognitive world which we associate with our near relatives, the great apes, matches more or less one-to-one with the one which we find inside the bird brain of at least the crows, the parrots, and possibly some of the other groups as well. Now, this is by no means a single convergence, because in fact, oopsie daisy, sorry, I've left one out. I was going to show you a dolphin, but let me go on to the humans now, because the dolphins were another example. This is all fine and large, so we have these examples of evolutionary convergence at many levels, from molecular to behavioural, and we have examples of cognitive convergence. Nevertheless, our problem at the moment, and I should have really used a more up-to-date slide where this Austrian flung himself out of a balloon at 23 miles, but the caption remains exactly the same. What other species would think this is a sensible thing to do? You have to give it to us. You know, there is something very strange about us. There certainly is. And, of course, so far as paleontology is concerned, we have by no means a complete record, but nevertheless one which is more than adequate to depict in some considerable detail how, in a roughly 6 million years, we transformed ourselves from this barrel-chested, walnut-sized brained, long forelimbs, this wonderful gracile feature here. That's you and me. So we can see the osteological and to some extent the behavioural changes, but what exactly happened? And one of the previous speakers was sort of speculating on, you know, to put it in a nutshell, at what point, if we had a time machine, would we decide no longer to put them in a zoo, but to invite them to tea? And this is a very, very difficult question indeed. Now, we can approach this in a number of different ways, but one ingenious way, of course, is again by counterfactual through the agency of science fiction. And this is a cover of a book written by Harry Turtledove called A Different Flesh. Now, again, I don't have time to go into the details, but in outline, what it asks us to think about is a possibility, and I know that half of you in the room will be disappointed to hear this, but the Americas were never colonized by modern humans, they never got there, but only by Australopithecines. So this explains this rather striking picture where a Davy Crockett-like figure has been attacked by a saber-tooth, but has been rescued by an Australopithecine. So when the Europeans arrive on the American shores, there on the shore are awaiting the Australopithecines. What happens? We are telescoping roughly 6 million years of time. Do we invite them to tea? And in fact, Turtledove explores this in a number of very ingenious ways. And I have to say, to the first approximation, it's all pretty depressing. But that sort of imaginative exercise, I think, may sometimes help us to see how humanness emerged from, in some ways, an unremarkable process. Now, I don't want to make particular claims, and again, perhaps this will come up in discussion, and we're now moving to territory which I think will dismay a number of people. But I was very struck by a book I read some years ago, written by this Australian philosopher, David Stove. And I have to say, if I was at a meeting of evolutionary biologists, I would be probably, well, at the most gentle, offered a taxi to the station, or probably more likely stoned, to show a book which is called Darwinian Fairy Tales. Well, I'm not here in detail to discuss Stove's thesis, but in a nutshell, what he's trying to persuade us is that he has no problem about evolution, he has no problem about our descent from apes. But if you think that humanness as we understand it, including especially our altruism, can be explained in terms of the processes which we see in other animals, forget it. Why am I so interested in this argument? For two reasons. First of all, because Stove is a wonderful writer and also deeply politically incorrect. Very, very amusing at times, and we're not allowed to laugh anymore. No. And the other aspect about it is, of course, that not only was he a philosopher, but he was an expert on Hume, and he was an atheist. So he had no axes to grind in the way that you might think at first sight he was trying to suggest. So here too, we're dealing certainly with unfinished business, and it may come up in discussion, but nevertheless I want to use these as pointers. Now, to draw towards a quick sort of conclusion, one of the things which I think is very interesting about the speculations regarding the evolution of intelligence, which is familiar to evolutionary biologists in all sorts of ways, is that much of what you need in terms of the molecular building blocks is available long, long before the complex system itself evolved. So in the case, for instance, of nervous systems, something like a third of the genes which you require have already evolved at the level of, well, yeast, but obviously, let's go back, at the level of yeast, in the form of the mushroom, and in Arabidopsis in these plants here. Now, this is not surprising because the nervous system, to some extent, is a chemical arrangement, and of course what happens in other systems is then co-opted, if you like, for the nervous system. But this gives us a little bit of encouragement that involving a nervous system per se is not necessarily fantastically difficult. And correspondingly, again, this is a very interesting area, but it's now clear that, for example, in terms of nervous systems themselves, a good part of what we call the post-synaptic equipment has evolved in organisms which themselves completely lacked a nervous system and have again been brought on board in very interesting ways to enable synapses themselves to function. But that still leaves us with the big question, the big one, and that is, what is the nature of our consciousness? What is the nature of our cognitive capacities? And this is where I begin to unhinge you, at least I hope I do. How am I doing for time, Paul? You've got... Excellent, that'll do perfectly, thank you. Again, this is a gigantic area, and in my view is that attempts to understand consciousness are one of the great graveyards of intellectual inquiry. But this is certainly not a view shared by a number of other people, and Dan Dennett most famously, I believe, is confident that somehow these things have been explained. And perhaps unworthy, all I would observe is that although this it could well be true, it's a great shame that the Nobel Committee has not yet identified this advance in human understanding. I think consciousness is a far more severe problem than is sometimes realized. But there are a few straws in the wind to suggest that we might be able to think metaphysically about this. To begin with, I was enormously struck by a paper written some years ago on convergence in animal music, written by Patricia Gray and others in Science. And of course we know that animals such as this humpback whale here and birds already mentioned are capable of producing song, and this is a convergent, and of course you can explain this from the aspect of the production of sound through the vibration of columns of air. But as Gray also pointed out, music involves so much more for us, melody, harmony, but so too in many animals. And then she made this wonderful, in my view, leap of imagination to say, well, is it possible, in fact, the reason why these musics are the same is because they are all accessing, quote, a universal music. Here we have a sort of Platonic idea. And of course, this universal music is not a sort of universal hum. It's the expression of Wagner and Mozart and people like that. And the reason why they move us is by no means accidental. And I think it was John Polkinghorne in his address a couple of days ago who drew attention to Wigner's unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics and the fact that to many mathematicians, not all, they believe that they actually discover these things rather than invent them. Now, there's a great deal more to be said in these sorts of areas, and again, I have to flash along very quickly indeed, but I think what applies to mathematics may also apply to language. And although, again, in the way that David Stove would probably deride the idea that it's simply an extrapolation of animal vocalizations, is perhaps time for a reinvestigation. Now, this man here is Owen Barfield, one of the famous Christian Oxford Christians, a great friend of C.S. Lewis. And again, I don't have time to go into the details, but Barfield is difficult to read. A good deal of what he has written has yet to be published, but he had some extremely original ideas about the origins of language, especially in terms of its mythopoeic capacities. And he was especially influential on this man here, J.R.R. Tolkien. And again, there's no time to go into the details, but in outline, I think it's no accident that Tolkien's writings seem to touch on realities which are often imitated, but almost never matched in terms of their ability to see very, very deep into the nature of who we are. Fine and large, so we have, if you like, these mysteries of language and mathematics. They're accessible in one sense, but incomprehensible in others. But let me introduce you very quickly to a couple of totally incomprehensible instances. And I think probably for about 95% of you, you won't believe what you're about to hear. What I want to do is introduce two examples of, in a sense, stepping out of space and time. And as I say, I am a professor in Cambridge, I'm a fellow of the Royal Society, all that sort of nonsense. But I don't know what to make of these. They might be quite well known to some of you, and I'll just go through them very quickly indeed. The first involves this man here, Victor Cochrane, and he was a pilot. He served in the RAF, and he was flying above Scotland, and he went into some extremely bad weather. The plane was being bounced around, he was in a biplane and all the rest of it. He came out of the cloud into sunshine, it was much quieter, and beneath him he saw an airfield which he actually knew quite well. This is Drem Airfield down here, and it's not entirely clear from this reconstruction, but he saw down on the ground people working in blue overalls, a number of biplanes, but also a monoplane. That monoplane, of course, is a Spitfire. Now, there's nothing wrong with this. The only problem is that he was flying above this airfield in 1936, and Drem was not a functioning airfield. In other words, somehow he'd gone in advance of something like 4 years in time. Now, the fact that he's a pilot in the RAF does not mean that he's a reliable observer, but he's the sort of person who you might, in a day-to-day basis, trust. So what exactly was going on in this occurrence? Here's another one which I've been very struck with for many years, and involves, in fact, the prototype, for want of a better word, of Father Brown, written by G.K. Chesterton. This is the original Father Brown, Father O'Collins, who worked up in the North Country. And in his autobiography, he gives an account of how one time he was invited to the local lunatic asylum, where the evening beforehand, an individual had been brought in, literally raving mad. And of course, in these days, what you used to do is put them in a padded cell, and they'd shriek and groan and throw themselves against the wall. And then either they were dead, or in some way they'd exhausted themselves. And then the primitive techniques at that time would try and at least make some sense of his condition. In any case, he was invited into the lunatic asylum, and in this padded cell, there was a window much higher up than here, and it was completely broken, and there was nobody in the padded cell. So he could see the clouds drifting past. So somehow this person had translated himself completely outside the padded cell somewhere else and never seen again, as it so happened. So I understand from his biography. So again, this was a man who was hugely influential on G.K. Chesterton. And G.K. Chesterton was one of these people who insisted on truth. And great. And here too, so like Victor Cochrane, this is a person of utter probity. And perhaps they were pulling his leg. Perhaps they thought it was a joke just to amuse the priest or something like that. But the way he writes about it. And these two examples, of course, could be multiplied by many, many others. And even one or two may have even had personal experiences of this type. But it is the suggestion that the way that we see time and space, in a way, works on a day-to-day basis. I'm not invited to step out of third-floor windows on a regular basis. But then when we go back to consideration of what I said right at the beginning, and then consider not specifically the metaphysics as a whole, but the metaphysics of Christian theology, then, of course, as you'll know, what happened, I think it was April the 3rd AD 33. It seems to be tied down with some degree of accuracy now. And again, other people, I think yesterday, were referring to the fact that this historical evidence, I think, is as strong as it possibly can be. The point here, of course, is that what we have is a sequence of events which eventually leads to the resurrection. And again, in a certain way, as, of course, Tolkien insisted to Lewis in that famous stroll in Addison's Grove in Magdalen College and around about 1933, this was a myth which had become true. But so far as we're concerned, separated by some 2,000 years from the event, although I don't deny that I have met people who've met Jesus, actually I haven't, but other people literally have seen him there, so there we go, that's another story, is one where it's captured as well by this fantastic painting by Mantegna here on the harrowing of hell. And these sort of different clues which seem to come together suggest to me that we really do have, if not a way forward, I think we should have a great deal more confidence about when we are trying to deal with our materialist colleagues or those who are devoted completely to a naturalistic set of explanations, that, again, I was in Berlin a couple of weeks ago, and this particular painting is not in the collection there by Caspar David Friedrich, but nevertheless, this to me epitomizes what I think to some of my hard-headed materialist colleagues would be regarded as mere daubs of a pigment on a canvas, but so far as I'm concerned, indicates a complete set of potentialities. And if we can reassure ourselves that these potentialities have hardly been explored, not least through science, then I think we really have something to live for. So I'll stop there. Thank you much.
Thank you very much. You're welcome. Sure. If there was any quick technical question that would be best asked now, well, the slides are on the screen, maybe you could ask it, otherwise we'll save the questions for after Gunther's talk. So, any offers? Okay. Yeah, Ted.
Sorry. Is your piece towards the